does someone get away with something like this?
All it takes is someone not checking, right?
Mondays with Mike.
Mondays with Mike. Mondays with Mike.
So, okay, there was a fire in Dallas this week, which was evidently caused by a gas explosion, which I thought the NBC sort of tersed over, but they did say it. I wouldn't have known otherwise. What happened here? How common are gas leak explosions, and how much of it comes from gas instead of bad infrastructure?
Yeah, so for a gas explosion, what likely happened, I'm not an expert on this, obviously, but for an explosion to happen, there had to have been enough gas, and then it ignited, right? So that means that it went undetected long enough that it couldn't be responded to in a fast enough manner. If you look at the reporting on this, though, the first responders they were right there, about to intervene and respond to this. They were just setting up the scene, and then it went boom, right? Like they were there responding to it to try and stop it from happening. They just couldn't quite stop it in time. For how it gets to that point, it's usually an issue of detection, right? That there's not tools in place detecting the leak fast enough to notify the appropriate authorities to deal with the problem fast enough. That's usually the issue. And for something like that to happen, that's usually comes down to regulation, right? The code standards for building codes that they don't have enough detectors or tools in place to detect this kind of leak fast enough. At least from my cynical point of view, it's always about money. That some group lobbied to make sure that these kinds of regulations aren't in place because it costs money to install those kinds of systems and it costs money to maintain those kinds of systems. And when you're talking about things like apartment buildings or apartment complexes or places where people live, part of the way you make money there is you try to reduce as many costs as you, it's anything where you make money. You try to reduce as many costs as you can that you're not legally required to pay, right? And so in this case, it's something like that where it's one of two things. They either have regulations on the books that say you have to have the ability to detect this amount of gas being leaked with some kind of detection system, and it wasn't enforced enough, or that regulation doesn't exist, that there's no requirement to detect that amount of gas leaking to such a degree that it results in an explosion. Talking about how common it is, there was a group, the Public Interest Research Group, that they did a study on this, and they found from 2010 to 2021 that gas leak incidences that reached the level that they required federal reporting, it was 2,601 of them, and of those, 328 resulted in an explosion, right? So it's not that common. It's really not that common.
Okay.
It happens, but it doesn't happen to such a degree that the point I'm trying to make is that there are other risks that we take in daily life that are much riskier than this particular risk, specifically car accidents and car injuries. We've talked about that people take really high risks in terms of driving cars. But in terms of how does it get to a point where this happens, in almost every circumstance, it all has to do with a lack of oversight, a lack of regulation or inspection, or some kind of detection on the ground, right? Because this is a known risk. They know this can happen, right? Any kind of thing that involves gas or methane, it's known that this can happen and on occasion does happen. But it's one of those things, actually, when I'm thinking about this, do you remember that apartment complex in Florida that collapsed where
Yes.
and part of the reason there was money. They knew it was a problem. They couldn't get the people who lived there to pony up the money to fix the problem. If you look at the whole sad saga there, that they knew this is a problem. We need to fix this. But the way they went about trying to fix it was that they went to the residents and essentially said, we're going to charge you a lot more money to do this work to fix this. And if I remember the story correctly, I could be wrong. I don't think I'm wrong. I read through this. I was like, why did this happen? What happened was that the residents couldn't agree to pony up just a huge amount of money that they would have needed to pay to fix the problem that they knew was a problem. So I worry that part of the issue here, because this was an apartment complex, is something like that they knew there was a problem, but that they didn't want to pay to fix the problem. and that the failure in our society is that we didn't use the tools we have available to us to force a company to fix a problem, right? There are tools that can do that, specifically regulations, that you find them so much that their choices are either fix the problem or lose your business, that the government literally will just take the property. We didn't reach that point. Why didn't we reach that point? This is it was in Texas, was where the fire happened. I'm not sure you've noticed that Texas has some really strange politics.
Sure does. Strange electric grid, too.
And so, look, this is not going to be a very nice thing to say. If people elect politicians who are actively antagonistic towards the idea of government having any role in their lives, then occasionally the things that are collective action problems that government would intervene and could intervene where your average person could not intervene because they don't have the powers that government has, results in a problem like this. I'll list you a handful of examples we've talked about in the podcast. Flooding in, again, Texas. What happened with the flooding in Texas? There was a camp that was part of a flood plan. What did they do? They advocated to get removed from the flood plan such that it was out of sight, out of mind, right? If they weren't part of the flood plan, they wouldn't have to change their actions to build above the area that would get flooded. So what happened in that flood? The areas that were below the line that they said would get flooded got flooded. The areas that were above the line that the experts said wouldn't get flooded didn't get flooded. So what does that mean? It means that the government knew there was a problem. They had a flood plan that said, in no uncertain terms, one area will flood, one area will not. Only the government could have intervened in that moment to fix it. They could have said, move all of your cabins above the area that will get flooded, period. Didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? That's the lingering question for any of this. In any of these circumstances, it's always money, but it's not just money. It's the ineffectiveness of elected officials to have the moral fortitude and the political courage to say no to their constituents. And it's not abstract. It's a failure on the part of voters to elect people who will stand up for them. And it's a failure on the part of those who get elected that they're so unable to take the actions necessary to look. People don't like to hear hard truths. So people who get elected more than once generally will try their very best to just not tell people hard truths. They'll try to finesse the truth. They'll try to talk around the issue. They'll try to say it was an act of God, or nothing could have been done, or it was some kind of, it's out of our hands.
That would be so terrible if they said there was a gas explosion, God needed another angel. Gosh, that would be so bad.
I'm not going to swear. I know that we try to keep the podcast clean,
Family
but
show.
how about this? Nonsense. Government exists to solve collective action problems. If there's a river flooding, you build a levee. If there's a fire, you put out the fire. If there's an earthquake, you rebuild the roads. You have an emergency plan. You have an alarm system. If there's a tsunami, this is the one that I still am just like, what is going on? You have a tsunami warning system. If you defund NOAA, the ones who provide the tsunami warning system, how do we know that there's a giant wave headed our way? Right? I don't understand for even a second anybody who looks out at the world and sees these developed countries and science and technology. They learn how to read, they learn how to do math, and decides, you know what I want less of? The people who understand how to solve problems so that I don't die when a tornado hits, or a fire hits, or an earthquake hits, something that's beyond my individual power to deal with. I don't understand that particular logic of thinking somehow that the private market will fix a problem. No, they won't. The private market will run away. They'll just go somewhere else where they'll make money or they'll lose the money. There's no magic cure-all to the billionaires will not save us, if you want to think about it that way, right? Look at where they spend their money. They spend their money on private bunkers and islands in the middle of nowhere, right, where no one will get to them. They spend money on yachts and helicopters and submarines too.
Did you see Zuckerberg's yacht pull into Lake Union or whatever it was?
No, I didn't. But the whole point I'm making is, like, if you want to see how much faith they have in people and government to actually like address the issues that we're facing, the answer I would say is very little, right? That these people who have vast resources look out at the world and go, you know what? I need to build a rocket ship to get away from this planet, or I need to build I need to build a private bunker to wait out the storm, or I need to build a self-sustaining yacht to live out on the ocean where no one will bother me except the sharks and the fish and birds, and I'll just sail off into the sunset while the world struggles, right? While the world runs out of water, runs out of food, runs out of arable land, and runs out of safe breathing air, right? Billionaires have the resources to get state of the art technologies for medical care, for air quality filters, for all the things, right? They have the money to figure out a way to survive things that your regular person would not be able to do. What that translates into, though, is that for the unscrupulous among them, for the ones who like making money and making more money, they all too often utilize their political power to figure out ways to make more money at the cost of things like safety and security and stability, right? Because government is the one that imposes those regulations. And because of Citizens United, the people with the most resources can lobby to accumulate more resources at the expense of your average person, right? Because they have a way out. Yeah. They have an escape plan. We don't. We have to live here.
There's no planet B. And they say that because we were taught, because it's money, right? It's money that certain people are wealthy enough that they don't want to pay, so they lobby. And then it's money and that they appeal to in tax money. We don't want to pay this because we want to have slightly bigger harvests every year, but then one of the harvests, a pestilence comes along and wipes out our harvest. And you said in the California governor section that being a billionaire is a choice, and that's right. In 100 years, our people, we face a fork in history. In 100 years, are people going to prize the fact that you were a billionaire, that one was a billionaire? Or, so are we a world of plutocracy, or are we a polity, where the measure of the flourishing of a life is being able to say, I contributed to the community, I contributed to the nation? Which one will be that which is remembered fondly in 100 years? And it depends on the choices we make. Go for it.
So there was a time where that's how the wealthy were viewed, right? You think of the philanthropy of building, Carnegie is the one I'm thinking of building libraries and museums and building universities and figuring out a way to leave a legacy of helping society. There seems to be a real movement among some subsection of the billionaires to move away from being part of any society. So I'm thinking in particular about that ship they wanted to build, where they wanted to build their own ship out in the middle of the ocean that wasn't connected to any country's tax regimes. That effectively they wanted to take all their wealth and siphon it out of the countries and then move out into the middle of the ocean where in international waters there is no sovereign control over, so no one can be taxed. There's one exception. The United States taxes citizens no matter where they are in the world. Actually, there's a few, but that's the one I know of, is that the United States has like a universal tax policy. It's a little complicated, but the point is that there is some movement amongst the very, very wealthy in the world to move away from even having to contribute to the societies that made them rich, right? Because you only get wealthy to that level by raking in exorbitant amounts of profit and value from existing societies, right? It's a really bizarre thing, though, because that ship almost definitely could not be resupplied without participating in importing just exorbitant amounts of stuff constantly, unless it was all self-sustaining, right? Unless it's all solar and they desalinized the water and they had, I would think for repairs that at some point they'd have to dock and repair their stuff. But anyways, the point I'm making is that there was a time where the very wealthiest contributed significantly to philanthropy, and now they're not as much. There's a few, right? There's Bill Gates, and there's Buffett said he'll do the Giving Pledge, and Dyer's one of them where he does all these different things. And there was that one guy who was a billionaire who he spent almost all his money putting kids through college. There's a few examples, of billionaires who decide to spend a ton of actually Mackenzie Bezos, right? Her last name's different now, I think, but the
Oh, Jeff Bezos fan.
yeah, the ex-wife of Bezos, she's contributed millions of dollars to any number of nonprofits and charities and stuff that he obviously hasn't, right? Because he's very rich still, and she's not as rich because she spent all that money, right? But it's a question of values, right? Do we value the things that help to improve society, or is it just about accumulating so much wealth and so much power just to make out like a not a bandit, but to make out like a god, right? To build your own Mount Olympus and look down at the mere mortals and go, you don't get to be up here, we get to be up here.
I am Zeus. I shall throw you thunderbolts.
Pretty much, right? Like, look, there is a future where if these space companies did privatize all their space technology, in theory, they could go to their own planet and just take over the planet, live in their own little planet, no one else invited, right? It could get there. But if we get to that point, then it becomes really difficult for the people who don't have that technology to get any off planet. Earth could become a real. It's actually, I'm on the fence on that one. If all the very wealthy decided to just leave, in theory, they would open the opportunity for all the resources that they were exploiting or using to be used by other people, right? Because they would be leaving. They'd be using resources.
Sure, they'd probably need stuff, and we'd need stuff, so not the worst thing in the world.
It's one of those things, but I don't know. I'm skeptical though because the wealth of these people is only as effective as a system in which they can spend that wealth, right? Like your money is only money so long as it's recognized as money.
Yes.
So if you go out into the middle of nowhere in space and there's no economy around for you to spend your money, you suddenly are faced with a real dilemma. You are only as effective as the resources you brought with you or the resources you can use wherever you go, right? Maybe someone will figure out, but that would mean pretty much spending all your money before you leave, right? All of it.
Yeah. So to wrap up the natural gas thing, let's make this into one big question. Is it time to cancel natural gas in the home because of health risks or safety risk? Or if you don't buy that, at least should new buildings be required to go all electric?
So no to both of those. I'll say no to the first one because the risks are very low and we take much greater risks in life and still live with that as a trade-off for cars and transportation. People need to be able to afford to live somewhere. That's a dramatic action that I think is too great of an extreme. There is an answer to this, and it's better regulation and using existing technologies to detect if gas is leaking and then responding accordingly faster, right? And there's ways to do that without removing gas completely. Because a huge portion of this would be really bad for especially developing countries and what we might call the third world. Their only option in some cases for heating or cooking or a variety of other things is gas. And so it would be really cruel to deprive them of even the ability to cook their food or heat their food or warm their where they live without exploring the other viable alternatives first. For the other one about new buildings being required to be electric, no, again, because it can be more expensive. And as we've seen for somewhere like Texas, the electric grid can be very expensive based off of weather issues like cold or heat, which is weird for somewhere that gets hot, but that's what's happened in Texas, that the cost can be prohibitively expensive. And so gas is one of those things that provides a cheaper option compared to just a huge sticker shock from the electric bills that can happen. And this in particular matters for AI data centers, because if you look at the state of Maryland, the people living in Maryland are complaining because they're being charged for out of state data center costs. Whatever. It's like, why are they being charged extra money to pay for something that's not even where they live? And it's whoa. But that's one of those issues with electrics. This would be too much of an infringement on their freedom. But I do think there should definitely be a serious remodel of all houses that use this kind of gas that cause this kind of explosion, that at an absolute minimum, they have to install those any kind of thing that can detect that leak, and then they need much faster reporting mechanisms. Maybe a dedicated society maybe could have a dedicated gas reporting body that doesn't depend on something like firefighters that respond to multiple types of calls. That maybe if we just have like a dedicated gas response issue because
Yeah.
if there's a circumstance where resources might be diverted because there's multiple emergencies and you have to choose which one to get to first, there's
Yeah.
a lag time. And so I think for something like this, there needs to be just a team
You
always on standby.
Yeah, you could have pretty. I think this would be pretty easy actually. You could have a gas alarm, which you could just buy at the store, which first of all has a GPS in it, so it's like, here's where I am, then has an ability to connect to the internet, and it could just send the report directly. It could just say, I detected this much gas at this place. You could have the alarm reports directly.
Yeah, and there should be mandatory responses, right? So if the gas leak is detected over a certain amount where you know there's a danger, then there needs to be a mandatory immediate response. And I think the
Yeah.
way to get there is you have on standby some team within however many miles able to respond, similar to how we have fire stations, right? There's fire stations within a certain degree of distance and planning so they can respond to different areas. I think something like that it would be really important. This is also though one of those things where emerging technologies it could help. So things like robots, if you can get somebody
Yeah.
to go into the danger zone where there's a gas leak that's about to explode that isn't human, right? Because fear is a big limiter on the ability to respond to certain types of crises. If there was a way to get a robot that has no fear of death into these extreme situations to do something better than nothing, that could help, right? I'm not saying it will, but I'm saying that there is an opportunity in there for innovation in terms of how we respond to crises. Because human fear does stop humans sometimes from intervening where intervention could still occur. That's my
Yeah.
last word on that, is that there are things that probably could be done and should be done that aren't being done. Specifically the
Right.
gas detection stuff, and then maybe a team on standby.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sounds good. We'll keep blazing the trail. So there was this guy, I had to look up his name, David Rush, a senior official or former senior official at the CIA, was reported as stealing $40 million in gold bars from them. He claimed them as a work-related expense. He also, in his hiring, according to AP, falsely claimed to be a Navy pilot. How does someone get away with something like this?
All it takes is someone not checking, right? That there's no follow through or that no one picks up a phone and calls, right? Because these seem like pretty straightforward things to figure out, right? There's not that many Navy pilots, right? It takes a lot of money to train a Navy pilot, I would know, being that,
Me too.
I would know, given my conversations I've had in the past, of how much time and money and energy it takes to train a Navy pilot, right? So this is one of those things where you literally, someone who was supposed to pick up the phone and follow through and actually do the background check and go through all the things you're supposed to do when hiring somebody didn't, right? Because this is not something that would be missed if you just call it. It's the same government, right? The military is the same U.S. government as the CIA. They're the same. They have the same money. They're paid by U.S. taxpayers, so they could just call them up, right? Just call up the Navy.
Yeah.
Did this guy work for you? We have, you can tell us, right? Did he actually fly planes? So that is very bizarre, right? That it got missed because it means somebody didn't do their job. And it also, so I was thinking about this. It means that when he was hired, somebody didn't do their job. While he was employed, somebody didn't do their job because they never vetted him fully for national security issues, for example. Because if he was a pilot, that meant that he, in theory, would have flown to more than just the US. He could have flown all sorts of places in the world. And the question is, did he ever interact at any point in time in his life with people from other countries? Any kind of intel agents or officers or spies from other countries? If he was, because pilots, they fly aircraft, right? And if he was deployed, the question would be, was he deployed overseas? At any point in his deployment, did he ever interact with anyone? Did he ever get into debt? These are all questions that would need to be asked, right? If given the role that he was employed in, and it looks like they weren't. So the question is, weren't they? Who wasn't asking the questions, and why weren't they? Those are the alarm bells in my head. It's like, how does this happen? How does somebody get a job this senior, this high up in a spy agency, without the spy agency actually knowing what his history is? Somebody
Yeah.
did a bad job.
You know what we need? We need two people to check the references. And we need them to have knowledge that the other is checking the reference. They don't have to know. In fact, they shouldn't know who they are, who the other person who's checking the references is, if the organization is big enough, which in the CIA's case it would be. That would solve it, I think. So it seems like a one-off to me.
So I'm just surprised there's not a counterintelligence agency whose sole function is just to vet everybody that works at the counterintelligence agencies, right? You know how police departments have an internal affairs division, the cops who
I wasn't aware, but it makes sense.
yeah, cops who investigate other cops. Have you ever seen the movie The Departed with Matt Damon, Leo DiCaprio, Jack Nicholson, where it's the Boston Police Department and the guy?
Sounds like an all-star cast, but no, I haven't seen it.
Oh, you should see it. Where Matt Damon. I'm not going to spoil it actually, but it's a great movie for thinking about how something like this could happen, because police departments have internal affairs divisions where their whole job is to make sure that the other cops are on the up and up. They make sure that the other cops aren't taking bribes, aren't heavily in debt, aren't committing crimes, aren't secretly serial murderers, that kind of thing. Where they're not very liked by their other peers because they're pouring through the people's records, their bank accounts, their health records, their personal emails and correspondence, all that. But the whole point of that is you need something like an internal affairs for the CIA, because these are people who know all the secrets, right? They're the keepers of the keys. They have access to the vault, right? If you don't have somebody making sure that the agents aren't secretly twirling away millions of dollars in gold bars, then some of the more unscrupulous people in the world may somehow stumble their way into this very difficult to get job and start squirreling away huge amounts of money.
Yeah.
Sounds like that's what happened here. But it begs the question, though, what kind of operation would possibly require physical gold in that amount instead of cash, wire transfers, cryptos? Why would they need the gold in the first place? How did this happen?
So I gave that one a good think. And it's parts of the world are unbanked. They don't have access to any financial system, any banking system, especially the places that are serious anarchy. So places like Somalia, for example, or places that are in a serious civil war. So the Congo, or places that are war zones, right? So places that don't have access to a stable financial system. Places where also you've got a clock ticking, right? There's an immediacy because you may not be able to talk with the person again, right? If somebody's in an active war zone where bombs are dropping or drones are flying or missiles are flying or bullets are flying, your ability to get the information from them may be in that moment, right there. And what is gold that makes it different compared to any other kind of currency or asset? Gold is virtually untraceable, can be melted down, and it's easy. Its value doesn't necessarily change anywhere in the world. If you go to a place that buys gold, they will buy the gold at the current market rate, right? And the thing with gold is that its value doesn't change, even if you melt it down to little tiny drops and carry thousands of little balls of gold and then put it all together and melt it back into a bar, right? It's easy to hide and it's easy to sell. That's the big thing. For things like you're talking about, things like crypto, difficult if you don't have access to the internet. Cash, difficult if you can't actually use the cash, right? Cash depends on a system that accepts the cash as a legitimate currency.
Yeah.
If you were trying to get an asset that's because remember, for assets in espionage, in many cases, they are taking extreme risks. They're taking a risk where if it's found out that they're spying in an oppressive regime, they will be executed on the spot.
Yeah.
Think North Korea, think Iran, think some of these places in the world where they don't hesitate, right? Places that have the death penalty.
The high seas.
Sure, and use the death penalty. How do you catch people in those circumstances? You provide incentives to those assets. You give them essentially an offer they can't refuse. You say, I will give you $1 million in gold if you give me this information right now of where the weapons are or where the leaders are, all that kind of thing. It's a whole game, right? Intelligence gathering is a whole thing, and it's relationships, right? It's human to human relationships. There's a whole thing involved there. So that doesn't surprise me. What surprises me is the amount of money and the fact that there wasn't any real oversight, apparently, over $40 million in gold bars, that somehow he just managed to walk out the door. That's what puzzles me. Of like, even if you give out that, maybe in the grand scheme of things, when you're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar budget, it's a drop in the bucket. But it's still,
Yeah.
there can't be that much gold just lying around, right?
Yeah, I don't know. If they're going to get the gold back, and if you must pay $40 million to get this guy who's obviously a bad apple out of the game, maybe you're willing to pay that and you'll probably get most of the gold back, maybe. Perhaps.
I understand that aspect of it. Say you're up against a multi-billion-dollar cartel, right?
Yeah.
Who are notorious for hunting down former people who rat them out and punishing them, right? So you have to offer, that's why things like a witness protection program exists, is that you have to provide a reason for somebody to give you information that you otherwise could not obtain. And in this case, the reason would be millions of dollars in gold. But the other problem here is, what if this was all just an elaborate con, that he was building a nest egg to run away to some country that won't extradite him to the U.S. and live lavishly in some villa somewhere, right? It just disappear off the map, right? It's not completely beyond the realm of thinking that this was all just one big heist for 20 years or however long he worked for this is his retirement plan. But it's crazy how much effort is involved in getting to that point. Like all the different polygraphs he would have had to undergo and background checks and just like a constant sense of unease doing a dangerous job. That's a lot of effort.
He'll have a government-paid retirement now in jail if he's guilty.
Yeah, allegedly, right? Like, how do we really know that
guilty.
he wasn't gonna spend $40 million in gold bars for his job? We don't actually know.
It was for the orphanage. It was actually, a whole thing was just like the plot of the Blues Brothers.
It's a tax write-off. Yeah.
Mondays with Mike.